I told the notary 2 sentences before she stamped the will, and neither one of them was in the document. My Uncle Ray never noticed. $11,400,000 was on the table that afternoon, and he spent the whole reading smiling at my cousins instead of watching me. By the end of this story, you will know exactly what those 2 sentences were and why they mattered more than anything written on that page. Before I get into it, welcome if you're new here. I tell true stories about the quiet corners of family money nobody wants to talk about out loud, and this one still doesn't sit easy with me, even months later. So stay with me, because the thing that finally broke this family open was a logbook, a plain, unglamorous, county-mandated logbook that I keep on a shelf behind my desk, the kind of record my Uncle Ray had never once thought to ask about. My name is Mia Parker. I'm a licensed notary, and I run a small title and escrow office 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind of place people walk into during the worst week of their lives, buying a house or closing one out. I've spent 11 years reading signatures the way other people read faces. You learn things. You learn that a rushed signature drags at the end. You learn that a nervous one presses too hard in the wrong places. You learn that a forged one, no matter how good the forger is, always tells on itself somewhere if you know where to look. My father was Walter Parker. He built a small chain of hardware stores from nothing, sold the last one 4 years before he died, and left behind $11,400,000, split, according to the will he signed 9 years earlier, evenly between his 3 children and in trust for his brother Ray, who had leaned on him financially for most of both their lives. Ray never held that against my father. He held it against the rest of us instead, quietly, for years, the way people do when gratitude curdles into resentment nobody says out loud. The reading was scheduled on a Tuesday. I almost didn't go because I already had the number memorized and the split memorized, and because funerals and readings blur together after a while into one long gray week. But I went, and I sat 2 seats down from Ray, and I watched him lean toward the notary, a woman I didn't recognize, and say 2 sentences to her before she stamped the final page. I didn't hear the words. I only saw his mouth move, saw her nod, saw the stamp come down. Everyone else was looking at the numbers on the page. I was looking at her hands. I should tell you who else was at that table, because none of this works without them. There was my Aunt Carol, Ray's wife, who had spent the last 2 years planning her daughter's wedding with the confidence of someone spending money she didn't yet have. There was my cousin Brett, Ray and Carol's son, who laughed too loud and paid for nothing and had, I would later learn, run up a debt to people who did not send polite reminder emails. And there was my cousin Dana, the bride, 26 years old, sweet in the specific way people are sweet when they've never had to ask where the money comes from, because someone has always quietly made sure they didn't have to ask. My father loved all of them. That's the part people skip when they tell revenge stories, and I won't skip it here. He loved Ray enough to bail out the marina business twice. He loved Carol enough to overlook the way she talked about money like it was air, unlimited and owed to her. He loved Dana enough that when he signed anything at all, he used one pen, a Gold's fountain pen that had belonged to his own father, worn smooth at the cap from 40 years of handling. He would not sign a birthday card without it. Everyone in the family knew that. It was practically a joke, the pen, until the day it wasn't a joke at all. I remember him at the kitchen table when I was maybe 9, uncapping it slowly, like the act itself deserved a little ceremony before he'd sign a permission slip or a check. He used to say a signature was a promise, and you didn't make promises with a pen you'd toss in a drawer and forget. I thought it was just one of his sayings back then. I think about it differently now. I want to give you one more piece of the past because it explains why nobody at that table was surprised when Ray reached for something that wasn't his. When I was 17, my father co-signed a loan for the marina, the first time, $40,000, and Ray paid maybe 6 months of it before my father quietly absorbed the rest without ever mentioning it on Thanksgiving. 6 years later, he did it again, larger this time, and again, nobody in the family said a word out loud because that was the deal we'd all agreed to without ever agreeing to it. Ray took, My father covered. The rest of us watched and called it generosity, because calling it anything else would have meant admitting we'd all agreed to look away. I remember one specific dinner, years before any of this, when I was maybe 24, watching Ray order the most expensive bottle on the list at a restaurant not unlike Bellamy's, sliding the check toward my father without even a token reach for his own wallet, laughing about it like the whole table was in on the joke. My father paid. He always paid. I think somewhere in there, Ray stopped seeing it as a favor and started seeing it as the baseline, the way people do when the exception happens so many times, it quietly becomes the rule. The reading ended without incident. The house on Lake Westcott, worth $2,300,000 on its own, was to be split along with everything else. Ray shook my hand. Carol hugged me and told me my father was proud of us all, which was true and also the kind of thing you say right before you take something from someone. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a colleague at the county recorder's office. A routine flag, nothing dramatic, the kind of thing that happens a dozen times a year and means nothing 99 times out of 100. A codicil had been filed against my father's estate. An amendment. It redirected the entire $2,300,000 from the lake house sale, all of it, away from the equal split and into what the document called, and I am quoting this exactly, family transition expenses. It was dated 11 days before my father died. It was notarized, and it had already been recorded, which meant someone had moved fast, faster than any of us had moved on anything since the funeral. I did not call Ray. I did the thing I actually know how to do. I pulled the notary's name off the filing, Sandra Voss. I didn't know her. I looked her up in the state registry the way I look up every unfamiliar name that crosses my desk, out of habit more than suspicion. Her commission had expired 6 weeks before the date on the codicil, not lapsed in some gray, arguable way. Expired. A dead credential notarizing a live document, which meant, under state law, the document had never been properly notarized at all. It was, as far as the law was concerned, a piece of paper someone had signed in a room with no legal witness in it. That should have been the end of it right there, a clean, technical kill. But I kept looking because 11 years of reading signatures does something to you. And something about the shape of my father's name on that page had been bothering me since the moment I first saw the scan. He hadn't used the pen. I want you to understand what that meant to me, sitting alone in my office at 8 at night with the codicil pulled up next to a birthday card from 3 years ago. My father did not sign things with a ballpoint pen. He never had. Not once in 40 years, not for anything that mattered. The signature on the codicil was smooth where his was always slightly heavy on the downstroke, thin where his always carried weight. It was close. Whoever traced it was patient and careful and clearly had practiced, but it was drawn, not written, and a drawn signature moves at a different speed than a lived one. You feel it before you can explain it. It took me sitting there that long to name my actual problem, and the money turned out to be the smaller half of it. The part I couldn't sit with was the idea that someone in my own family had decided, quietly, that I was the kind of person who wouldn't check, that I'd sign off on my own inheritance the way I signed off on being the reasonable one at every holiday, the one who didn't make waves. I'd spent my whole life being useful and easy to overlook, and Ray had built his entire plan on the bet that I would stay that way even now. That was the moment I stopped being the reasonable one on purpose, not loudly, just completely. Before I called anyone else, I called Renata, my therapist, mostly because I needed to say the whole thing out loud to someone who wasn't going to react with outrage on my behalf. She listened, and then she asked me the same question she always asks when I'm circling something. What do you actually want to happen here, separate from what you think you deserve? I told her I wanted the truth on the record. No scene, no apology I'd have to coach out of anyone. She said that sounded like a plan, and asked where the feeling underneath the plan had gone, because a plan alone was going to leave something unfinished in me if I skipped straight past it. I called my friend Priya after that, mostly for the opposite reason. Priya doesn't do measured. She's run her own contracting business since she was 24 and has zero patience for people who confuse family with immunity. She told me flatly that Ray had been skimming off my father's generosity for 20 years, and this was just the first time he'd left fingerprints. "Talk to a fraud investigator," she said. "Don't talk to Ray." I laughed for the first time in 3 days. That was the small, quiet thing I decided that night, sitting with my father's real signature on one screen and the fake one on the other. I wasn't going to accuse anyone at a family dinner. I wasn't going to cry or shout or hand anyone a printed page and wait for an apology that wouldn't come. My father spent 40 years signing his name the same careful way every single time. And somewhere in that, without ever meaning to teach me anything, he taught me that the quiet, exact record usually beats the loud, confident lie. I was going to be exact. I was going to let the paper do what paper does, eventually, to anyone reckless enough to fake it. I called Miles Chatterjee the next morning, a fraud investigator I'd worked alongside 2 other times through the state notary board. The kind of quiet, unhurried man who asks 3 questions and already knows the answer to 2 of them. I didn't tell him I wanted revenge. I told him I had a lapsed commission on a filed estate document and a signature I didn't trust, and I asked what the process looked like if I was right.
He told me the process was slow if I let it be slow, and fast if the person who filed it kept moving. Fraud cases die in paperwork unless somebody forces them into daylight. The strongest version of this, he said, ends with the person who filed it doing something in front of witnesses that confirms what the document already shows on its own. I asked him what that will take. He said it will take patience, and it will take me not tipping my hand before he was in the room. 4 days after the recorder's call, Carol texted me a photo of a beachfront venue with the caption, "We did it," then followed it with a second message that just said, "Thank your dad for us." I didn't respond that night. I sat with my phone face down on the counter for a long time instead, doing the math on how fast $2,300,000 had apparently already started moving. By the following Tuesday, Brett called me directly, which he almost never did. He wanted to know if I could get my copy of the estate paperwork moved through faster on my end, said he had some obligations coming due and didn't want to be the last one paid out. I asked him what obligations. He said it wasn't my business and laughed in a way that didn't sound like laughing at all. I told him distributions moved on the estate attorney's schedule, not mine, and he hung up without saying goodbye. 2 days before the dinner, Ray called himself for the first time since the reading. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked whether I'd seen anything unusual come across my desk lately, phrased so carefully I could practically hear him rehearsing it beforehand. I told him nothing unusual, which was true in the narrowest possible sense, since by then I already knew exactly what I was looking at, and there was nothing unusual about a man protecting a lie he built himself. He said, good, and then, almost as an afterthought, added that the family was counting on me to be reasonable about all this, the way I always was. "You know you owe us that much, Mia," he said, testing the phrase out early, the same one Carol would use 2 days later at the table. I said I'd see him at dinner. There was one complication I hadn't planned for. The day before Bellamy's, Dana called me, not Carol, not Ray, just Dana, sounding anxious in a way I hadn't heard from her before. She said she'd overheard her parents arguing about a notary fee and wanted to know if something was wrong with the estate, because if there was, she'd rather know now than find out at her own wedding. I almost told her everything right there on the phone. I didn't, because Miles had been clear that anything said before the dinner could give Ray time to rebuild his story instead of standing inside it. I told her I loved her and that I needed her to trust me for 1 more day, and that whatever happened at dinner wasn't about her. She went quiet, then said okay, in a voice that made it clear she already suspected more than she was saying. That was the part that almost stopped me. Not Ray, not Carol. The fact that Dana might get caught in the middle of something she hadn't chosen. I sat with that most of that night too, and decided the kindest thing I could actually do for her was let the truth arrive once, cleanly, instead of dragging it out in pieces that would only let her keep half believing the version her parents were selling her. There was a second complication I hadn't accounted for, and it arrived the morning of the dinner itself. Ray emailed the whole family, myself included, a scanned letter he claimed my father had dictated to him verbally in his last month, describing his wish for the lake proceeds to help fund the wedding. There was no signature on it at all, just Ray's own summary of a conversation nobody else had witnessed, typed up and dated after the fact. Miles read it over the phone with me twice before dinner and called it exactly what it was, an unsigned, uncorroborated account with no evidentiary weight whatsoever. The kind of thing people produce when they sense the real paperwork is about to fail them. It was Ray building himself a second story to fall back on, in case the first one didn't survive the night. And it told me more about how frightened he already was than anything else could have. I drove to Bellamy's that evening past the marina Ray spent 2 decades almost losing, its lights strung up along the docks the way they were always on a Friday, boats rocking gently against a low tide, and I thought about how much of my father's quiet money had gone into keeping that view exactly the way it looked right then, glowing and untroubled, for a man who'd never once thanked him out loud for it. I sat in the parking lot for a minute before going in, the pen sitting heavier in my jacket pocket than an object that small had any right to feel, and I ran through what Miles had told me one more time. Let the document speak first, let the filing date speak second. Only bring in what I could actually prove, nothing I merely suspected. My father used to say the same thing about closing a deal, though he never once used the word evidence for it. He called it not getting ahead of your own paperwork, and I understood, sitting there with the engine off, that I was about to do the most careful, most exact thing I had ever done in my life, in a restaurant that still had my childhood birthday parties stapled to its walls in old photographs near the host stand. 2 days later, Carol called me to invite me to dinner at Bellamy's, the steakhouse we'd gone to for every family occasion since I was a child. She said it was just a small family thing to celebrate Dana's venue deposit finally clearing. I already knew where that deposit had come from. I said I'd be there. I called Miles back before I called anyone else. He said he'd be at the bar, alone, like a man who happened to be dining by himself, and that I should not look at him twice once I walked in. I agreed. Then I did the one thing I let myself do, for me. I put my father's fountain pen in my jacket pocket, the actual pen, the one Ray had apparently forgotten existed, and I went to dinner. Bellamy's on a Friday night was loud in the particular way that makes it easy to talk about money without anyone at the next table caring. The breadbasket came out first, untouched, the way it always did before anyone got serious. Ray had already ordered a bottle of wine none of us had asked for, $190, before anyone else had even sat down. Brett ordered the porterhouse without glancing at the price, then added a second appetizer nobody at the table had asked for either, sliding the menu shut like the question of cost had never occurred to him. Dana was showing pictures of a venue on the coast, talking about a florist she'd already put a deposit down with, using words like non-refundable, the way other people talk about weather. Our waiter that night was a young man named Julian, quick and quiet on his feet, the kind of server who reads a table's tension in about 4 seconds and adjusts his pacing without ever making it obvious. I recognized something in him almost immediately, some younger version of myself, working a room full of people who'd never once considered what his night actually cost him. I made a point of thanking him properly every time he came by. Ray didn't look at him twice. Carol raised her glass early. "Family takes care of family," she said, and then, looking straight at me, added the line I'd already been braced for since the phone call 2 days earlier. "You know you owe us that much, Mia. Your father would have wanted the wedding covered. He always said family looks after its own." I let the silence sit there for a second longer than was comfortable. Then I said that I agreed family did look after its own and asked whose idea the codicil had actually been. Carol's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. Brett set his wine glass down slightly too hard. "What codicil?" he said, in the exact tone of a man rehearsing surprise he'd already used once before. I told them, calmly, that I'd found a filing at the recorder's office redirecting the lake house proceeds. I said the notary who signed off on it had an expired commission. I watched Brett's face do the math faster than his father's did, because Brett was the one who owed money to people who didn't wait politely, and he understood exactly how badly this needed to work. Ray tried the first thing people always try. He said I must be confused, that maybe there'd been some clerical error at the county office, nothing more. I asked if he wanted to call Sandra Voss and confirm her commission status himself, right there, in front of everyone. He didn't reach for his phone. That was the false hope, if you want to call it that. A single beat where Ray thought a firm enough denial might make the problem disappear the way problems usually disappeared for him, with someone else quietly absorbing the cost. It lasted about 4 seconds. Dana was the one who cracked first. She set her phone down on the table, screen still showing the venue photos, and asked her father, in a voice that had gone very small, whether the deposit money had actually come from Grandpa's account before the will was settled. Ray told her not to worry about it. She asked again. He didn't answer a second time, and that not answering told her everything the first answer hadn't. Ray tried the second thing people always try. He reached for the leather folder he'd brought with him, the one he'd set beside his chair when we sat down, and pulled out a printed copy of the codicil, sliding it across the table like it was proof instead of the exact evidence I'd been describing. "See," he said, "signed, notarized, filed. Perfectly legal." I picked it up. I held it next to the candle on the table, tilted it the way I tilt every questionable signature that crosses my desk, and I told the table what I was seeing. No pen lift where my father always lifted the pen right after the W, even pressure where his hand had carried a slight, permanent tremor for 6 years since a rotator cuff surgery changed his grip for the rest of his life, and drawn in ballpoint on a document my father would never in 40 years have signed with anything but the one pen he actually used. I took the pen out of my jacket pocket and set it on the table between us. Nobody moved. Ray started talking faster then, the way people do when the ground under an explanation gives out. He said the marina needed the transfer to clear before the season, said it was only ever meant to be temporary, said Dad told him, verbally, that the wedding should come first this year. He mentioned the unsigned letter he'd emailed everyone that morning, and I asked him, calmly, why a man who could produce a full written account of a private conversation couldn't produce a single witness who actually been in the room for it. He didn't have an answer for that either. Carol tried to talk over him, saying how none of this needed to become a scene, how family didn't air things out in restaurants, how her mother would never have embarrassed the family this way over money. Brett said nothing at all, which from Brett was its own kind of confession. He'd ordered a second glass of the $190 wine only minutes earlier, and I watched him set it down untouched, both hands finding his napkin instead, folding and refolding it. That's when Miles walked over from the bar. He didn't announce anything. He introduced himself, quietly, as an investigator with the State Notary Fraud Unit, and asked Ray, in the same even tone he probably used to ask 1,000 people the same question, whether he was aware that filing a document notarized under an expired commission constituted fraud on public record, separate from the forgery question entirely. Ray's face did the thing faces do when a private problem becomes a public one in real time. Carol's hand went to her water glass and stayed there, not drinking, just holding it, like the glass was the only steady thing left on the table. Julian passed by once during all of this, slower than he needed to, refilling water he hadn't been asked to refill, and I caught his eye for half a second.
He didn't say a word. He just gave the smallest nod, the kind one person gives another when they both understand exactly what kind of table this has become, and moved on before Ray even noticed he'd been there. Miles asked mildly whether Ray wanted to call Miss Voss himself or whether the county's records would do the talking instead. Ray didn't call her. He didn't need to. The recording stamp on the document he himself had filed, in a rush, to beat the estate's normal timeline, was sitting right there in black ink with his own signature on the cover sheet, submitted, time-stamped, his. He had filed it himself. Nobody made him rush it through recording 11 days after a lapsed commission notarized a forged signature. He'd done that part entirely on his own, because he needed the money to move before anyone had time to look closely, and in doing it, he put his own name on the exact document that would end up convicting him of using it. Carol tried one more time. "Family takes care of family, Mia," she said again, quieter now, almost pleading instead of pointed. "You owe us that much." I looked at her for a second. Then I said that my father took care of this family for 40 years, that he'd bailed out the marina twice without ever asking Ray to pay it back, and that he'd never once used the word owe with any of us in his entire life. "You owe us that much," I said back to her, slowly, so it would land the way it deserved to. "That's exactly right, Carol. That's exactly right. You owe us the truth about where that money actually came from, and everyone at this table just watched you fail to give it." I picked the pen back up off the table. I put it back in my pocket. Then I stood up, thanked Julian by name on my way past him, told Dana quietly that none of this was her fault, and walked out of Bellamy's while my aunt was still holding a wine glass she'd forgotten to drink from. I ordered a coffee at the place 2 doors down, alone, and let my hands stop shaking before I drove home. The codicil was voided within the month, on both grounds, the expired commission and the forged signature. Once the county cross-referenced Ray's own filing paperwork against Sandra Voss's registry status. Ray was referred for criminal fraud charges tied to the filing itself, separate from the underlying forgery, which investigators were still building out weeks later. Sandra Voss lost her license permanently and is facing her own charges for notarizing under a lapsed commission, whether or not she understood what she was signing off on. The lake house sold as originally intended, split evenly, the way my father's actual will, in his actual handwriting, in his actual pen, had always said it should be. I saw Renata the following week and told her the whole thing, start to finish, table by table almost. She didn't tell me I'd done the right thing, because that's not really how she works. She asked how it had actually felt, standing there with the pen in my hand, while my aunt held a wine glass she couldn't bring herself to drink from. I told her it hadn't felt like winning. It had felt like finally being believed by the one person in the room who'd never doubted me in the first place, which was myself. She said that sounded like the actual point, and I think she was right. Priya took me to dinner 2 nights later, somewhere with no family history attached to any of the walls, and made me tell the whole story again, slowly this time, laughing in the right places and going quiet in the others. When I got to the part about the folder and Ray sliding it across the table like proof instead of confession, she put her fork down entirely and said that was the moment she would have paid good money to see in person. I told her Julian saw it and that honestly, that was almost as good. 3 months later, Dana called me. She didn't ask for anything. She said she'd found out, after everything, that her father had known about the marina debt for a year before he ever touched the codicil, and that she was sorry she'd let herself believe the money for her wedding had simply appeared, the way good things always seem to appear for her. I told her I believed she hadn't known. I meant it. She's paying for the rest of her wedding herself now, smaller than planned, at a venue 2 hours inland instead of on the coast, and she told me she likes it better this way, which I choose to believe. Brett called me too, a few weeks after that, and asked without much shame in his voice at all, whether I could talk to the estate attorney about releasing his share early, since he still had people he needed to pay. I told him the estate would distribute on schedule, the same schedule for everyone, and nothing about that schedule was going to move for him. He hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't call him back. Priya says he'll call again once the schedule catches up to his patients. I think she's probably right about that.
Ray's criminal case is still moving through the system as I'm telling you this, slower than any of us would like, the way these things usually go once the paperwork leaves a restaurant table and lands in an actual courtroom. His lawyer is arguing the forgery and the filing should be treated as separate, lesser matters. Miles doesn't think that argument survives the county's records, and I've learned to trust his read on these things more than I trust my own hope for a tidy ending. I still have the pen. I keep it in the same drawer as my notary journal now, not because I need either one for work most days, but because they remind me of the same thing in two different ways. My father taught me, without ever saying so directly, that the quiet, exact record outlasts the loud, confident lie every single time. He never raised his voice to prove he was right about anything in his whole life. He just signed his name the same careful way, over and over for 40 years, until that habit became the very thing that caught the people who tried to fake it. I don't talk to Ray or Carol anymore. I still see Dana, occasionally, and I think that's the right ending, the honest one, not a clean reconciliation and not a total severing either. Some relationships in a family survive what happened, some don't. I've stopped pretending that has to be a tragedy. I went back to Bellamy's once, a few weeks after, alone and sat at the bar instead of a table. Julian was working that night too. He brought me a coffee without being asked and told me, quietly, that he'd never forget the sound of that folder sliding across the tablecloth. Neither will I. Some nights I think that's the sound the whole story actually turned on, louder in my memory than anything anyone said out loud. Here's what I actually want you to walk away with, because the story only matters if it's useful to you too. If you ever have to sign or notarize anything involving real money, especially estate documents, check the notary's commission status yourself directly through your state's registry before you rely on the stamp on the page. It takes about 2 minutes, it's public information, and almost nobody ever bothers to do it, which is exactly why it works as a scam in the first place. Most state registries let you search by name and give you the exact expiration date, no account required, no fee. And if you're ever looking at a signature that feels slightly off to you, the shape of the letters alone won't tell you much because a patient forger can get the shape close enough to fool a glance. The pressure and the pace matter more. A real signature carries the small, consistent habits of the person who's written it 1,000 times before. The same pen lift in the same place, the same slight drag where an old injury or a shaking hand always shows up. A forged one is drawn to look right, stroke by careful stroke, and drawn things move at a different speed than lived ones, once you know to look for the difference. Ask for the original document too, not a scan, whenever the amount involved is large enough to matter. Ink and pressure tell you almost nothing on a photocopy. If any of this sounds familiar, tell me in the comments, because I would genuinely like to know how many of you have your own version of the pen story. That's the thing about paperwork nobody reads twice. It always remembers more than the people who signed it. And next time, one clause remembers everything. In the next story, a stepmother tries to erase her stepson from a $25,000 inheritance out of pure spite, never noticing the no contest clause buried in her own will. Her signature on that petition costs her $400,000 in the same room where it all began. Click the card on your screen now to see exactly how one buried clause became her downfall.